Hello, once again. This is a panel that is genuinely dear to my heart because we are here to talk about this book, Fight for Liberty, Defending Democracy in the Age of Trump, and it is a collection of magnificent essays. Each of us has written a chapter. John wrote the introduction. A magnificent chapter. But if you read it very carefully, it's actually a sex novel. It's just as an anagram, so it really requires patient reading on your part to surface the 50 shades of the fight for liberty.
Impressive.
I'm just going to say a few words about the genesis of the book, and then really I want a vigorous panel discussion. But after the election, many of us who were either of the center-right or the center-left felt that something had gone deeply astray, not only with American politics and the choices that we had before us, but something was amiss in the world at large. That when we looked at Brexit in the UK, when we looked at the resurgence of illiberal democracy, proto-authoritarianism in Central Europe, when we saw that the threat from Vladimir Putin was only getting greater and graver, we felt, many of us, that there was a global crisis on our hands. And that was when Garry Kasparov decided to convene a group of like-minded people who saw the world in roughly the same way, and I think understood the threat in roughly the same way. He brought us together, and what first emerged from those initial meetings was a manifesto. It's included in the final chapter of this book. But then the thought was, why don't we get the smartest people that we know to contribute essays to put together and to revive the case for liberal democracy when it is being threatened, not just threatened physically, but threatened ideologically, threatened by the populism of the left and the right, threatened by the cult of the strong leader and the cult of personality, threatened by the forces of nativism and protectionism and division. And so this book is what came together, and it really is just an absolutely superb collection of essays. So what I'd like to do is start by asking each of you just to take, literally, I'm going to say a minute because that means you'll go for 2, okay? And the clock is ticking.
45 seconds.
Let's just start by describing the nature of the problem, and then let's start talking about the possibilities of solutions. Let's make this a solution-oriented panel. So John, why don't you start?
Oh, okay. The problem is, I'm a hopeless American biographer, so I'll stick with that. There are 2 numbers that I think help explain why we're where we are in terms of a populist reaction, and why a populist of the left seems to me is quite plausible that you could veer from a populist of the right to a populist of the left. I think we're living to some extent at the moment in the political equivalent of climate change. It's 90 degrees one day and 30 degrees the next. And so we bounce from guardrail to guardrail. I think that it's $130,000. That's the number that the Commerce Department estimates a family of 4 needs to lead what we would think of as a classic post-World War II middle-class life, $130,000. Household income is about $57,500. The other is 17%. That's the number that tell Gallup that they trust the federal government to do the right thing some or most of the time. It's down from 77% in 1965. So there's a drop of a 60-point drop there. So there is a skepticism, a lack of trust in institutions which require an active assent on an active trust on the part of civil society in order to make the enterprise work. And I think that trust deficit at a time of economic anxiety, if you're not already on the right side of the equation. If you're on the right side of the economic equation, you're doing just fine, and more than fine. If you're not, then you feel that the ladders, the means, the highway to the middle class may be foreclosed to you forever. Parenthetically, I think the rise of robotics and artificial intelligence is something that's going to make that problem much worse before it gets better. And so I think, as Bret says, the solutions, I don't know if you all know these folks as well, and some of you are these folks. You talk to manufacturing or information technology CEOs, and they will tell you that in 10 years, they think they can do what they need to do because of technology with 30 to 40% of the workers. So that means there are 3 million cars in the United States, so 3 million people who make their living driving a vehicle in the United States. What are we going to do when that is cut in half, which is probably going to happen shortly? So there's an enormous economic dislocation. And I think that's why people are anxious and looking for solutions. It finds its clearest form, its most obvious form in anxiety about ethnic minorities, which, as you all know in California better than I do, we're going to have a multi-ethnic society. We're also trying to do something in the United States that no other country has ever tried to do, which is run a big, pluralistic, democratic republic in a multi-ethnic society. So we have made this difficult. I don't think we should kick ourselves too hard for having some trouble getting it exactly right. So I think the trust and the prosperity are the two big drivers here. And my sense is it will require very creative economic thinking, because people are going to need to make a living to feel secure. If they're making a living and they feel secure, they are less likely to act out in the political arena.
Garry.
Since I left professional chess in 2005, I spent most of my time fighting Vladimir Putin's dictatorship in Russia, trying to restore the rule of law, freedom of speech, and just to bring back the fundamental democratic values.
Which was more fun, chess or that?
It's, the difference is that in chess we play by the rules. But what I never thought of, that one day I will have to fight for these values in the United States. So for me, the Trump's election was, it's not just a pinnacle of all these events, but it's like a culmination of the war, hybrid war, Vladimir Putin launched against the free world. Hybrid war because, as a KGB guy, you knew that he didn't have resources for the same confrontation during Soviet Union was engaged during the Cold War, but he could use financial resources, almost unlimited, because the free world keeps buying Russian oil and gas, and also the lack of political will, unlike during the Cold War, on US and the European side, to oppose his aggressive actions. And while Putin never had free and fair elections in Russia, he never was a part of a single debate. He actually won quite a few free and fair elections abroad. And he just realized that it's much cheaper as a campaign, but it could be far more effective, irony, to use modern technology invented in the free world to undermine the very foundation of the free world, and to divide the free world, the society of the free world, whether it's America and Europe, from within, by helping the fringes, the radicals on both sides. And that's what made him far more dangerous than the Soviet propaganda machine, Soviet communist rulers, because he didn't care about siding with only one political group. He is equally comfortable with far right and far left as long as they help him to spread chaos. And he's not selling you an ideology. I always called him merchant of doubt. And he found it far more effective. It's all you have to do is just to exhaust critical thinking, to make sure that people don't believe in anything. And it will help him to spread his propaganda, and also to help his multiple lobbyists and agents that he could buy around the free world. We sort of reached a point where even the United States was no longer immune against this campaign. I've been warning people for many years, literally shouting in the desert about Putin's threat, but nobody wanted to hear because it's so far away. And that's one of the culminations of this debate was on Bill Maher's show in May 2015, when I kept talking about Putin's threat, and Bill was so dismissive, telling me at the end, "Wake me up when he takes over Poland." Of course, I jumped on my chair saying last time we heard it, it ended up with the greatest disaster in human history 80 years ago. And of course, after 2016 elections, Bill has changed his views dramatically, going after Putin in almost every program. And I couldn't help teasing him on my Twitter saying, "Oh, by the way, Bill, it seemed that Putin decided to skip over Poland and went straight to Wisconsin." And why I thought that would be very important to bring people from center-right and center-left, as Bret described, is because it's hardly understood that democracy never died having threat only from one side. People still live under the impression that Hitler won free and fair elections in Germany. He had not. The best result Nazi Party showed at the elections in 1932 was just over 37%. But communists at these elections made nearly 16%. Which meant that more than half of German population rejected democracy. And seeing the simultaneous rise of radicals on both sides, I recognize that we have to do something to restore the political center. It sounds a bit dull, but the fact is that, that without this gravitas, democracy is in danger. And I could see that two major parties in the United States, instead of shielding us against the radicalism, they actually became the hotbeds of radical ideas, because both parties have been literally hijacked by the radicals due to, that's the specifics of American political system, gerrymandering and other things. And it was, from my perspective, it was very important to convey this message that it's not just America, as it was mentioned, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy. We could see the same simultaneous rise of radicals on both sides, and Vladimir Putin's hand, invisible hand, could be felt everywhere. So hopefully now we can rise to the occasion, and America could solve the problem domestically and also help the rest of the world to come back to normal functioning democracy.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about why Russia was successful here and why it has been successful in other places in helping existing extremist groups and non-centrist groups do well. John talked a little bit already about the economic basis of what we sometimes call populism, and what actually by which we really mean anti-democratic and authoritarian movements. I'd like to focus your thinking for a second on the information revolution that we're living through. Look, the way in which we now all get and process political information has changed with unbelievable speed over the last 10 years. The only time in history that I can think of that's comparable to this one is the moment of the invention of the printing press. And this was the radical 15th century technology that took reading and writing out of the hands of monks and gave it to everybody else. It had wonderful side effects. People became literate, literature spread, and people began to read and discuss. But it also led to the Protestant Reformation, very profound political polarization, and eventually 100 years of European wars, which we didn't really solve until we came up with the ideas of religious tolerance and the Enlightenment. So we are all living through something like that right now. It's just not an accident that in the United States, in Poland, in the Philippines, in countries that don't have that much in common politically or economically, you have this very strong and growing polarization, the splitting of society, conversations becoming much more extreme than they were before, and it's partly to do with the nature of how we're reading and seeing the news and discussing it. Social media has much like the invention of the printing press, does many wonderful things. It connects us to people all over the world, but it has also, the nature of it has also led all of us to live more polarized lives. We read, the way Facebook works, we see more and more what is recommended to us by friends. The algorithms emphasize extreme emotions and anger and anxiety and fear. The things that do well online, the things that sell, not just on Facebook actually, but online in general, are more extreme moods. Everything looks flat online. The distinctions that used to be made between the New York Times and I don't know, the publications of the Ku Klux Klan, that you could see them physically, how different they looked. Now each one looks just like the other. The hollowing out of the mainstream media, the collapse of the regional press. Some national newspapers are still doing well, but the regional papers, local papers, have less and less import. All of this has led, as again, not just our society, but really many, many democracies all over the world to become more polarized. And polarization has its own effects. So, you know, when you have groups who deeply distrust one another in the same country, when they no longer share a national debate, then it becomes much harder to share institutions. So one side begins to think that institutions like the police or the civil service or the judiciary, that these are institutions that have been captured by the other side. In other words, we don't share institutions, we don't feel ourselves to be part of the same country. Something like that has happened in the US. I've seen it in other countries. You know, in our country, it's emphasized and underlined by the fact that we no longer have any public broadcaster or any broadcasters at all, actually, whom we all want to watch, we all agree are newsworthy, and we all feel comfortable with. We live in MSNBC and Fox tribes. But that's not so unusual. It's very true. It's exactly the same situation in Poland. It's very similar in many other countries. And this profound polarization, this disorganization of politics has also undermined political parties, which were, by the way, being hollowed out already. They were more and more the province of professional politicians, even over the last 10 or 20 years. But, you know, now political parties are, function like, they stand for certain tribes, but they're also less and less trusted. In many countries, we see now kind of polarization of politics. It's much easier now to form new parties, to, from one day to the next, create new movements and groups online. We see that's what Macron in France did it, perhaps for the better. The Yellow Jackets, this protest movement, has done it for the worse. So we see the way in which information moves around has changed the way we're doing politics, and I think has led to an enormous democratic deficit and an enormous sense that the institutions we created that worked for us for the last 100 years aren't working anymore.
So let's move to a more future-oriented conversation. I thought you said something so interesting in our impromptu green room, just before we went on stage, John, which was that in Nancy Pelosi...
I thought you were reading my magnificent essay while we were... That's what you said you were doing.
No, I've read it, I've memorized it.
Have you? Okay.
Okay, but when we were speaking earlier before coming on stage, you said very interestingly that in Nancy Pelosi might be to the president what Joseph Welch was to a certain Wisconsin senator from the 1950s. Flesh that thought out.
I think it's possible. Presidents get in trouble a couple of different reasons. One, when they think they're smarter than we are and they can get something past us. We talked about this yesterday. Johnson in Vietnam, Nixon, Watergate, Clinton in his personal life. And so that's a warning sign. The other is when they break with their base. And I would never put these two in the same paragraph again, but George Herbert Walker Bush lost re-election in 1992 in 1990 when he broke with the Republican base by deciding to break his own campaign pledge from 1988. I think that Speaker Pelosi's victory over the president in forcing him to reopen the government after he explicitly shut it down, saying he would not reopen it without the wall. Then he reopens it without the wall. That means for the first time, in my thinking, the first time people who had cast their lot with the president looked at him and thought, you're not coming through. You're not delivering. You're being wimpy. You let this woman, which is probably what they thought, You're letting this girl beat you up. And I think that that's important. And I think that, you know, you can get 34% of Americans to say anything. That was the number that was Joe McCarthy's approval rating, according to the Washington Post, 5 months after he was censured. So in early 1955, he still had 34% of the country with him. But I think when you get to 30, 35, that's a different place than being at 40. And he's been at 40, 42 or so. And so I believe that there could be, when we look back on this, Pelosi beating him over the wall may end up being quite significant, because I do think that the show is wearing thin. And it will particularly wear thin if the folks who had put their money on him aren't getting what they want, and they're seeing the San Francisco liberal beating up their guys successfully.
I think that's true with one possibility, which is, or one exception, which is that if the Democrats choose to nominate someone who seems as extreme as Trump is on the other side, Americans will have to take a much harder look. I mean, that's why I actually have a hat made that says that literally it's a hat that says "Make America Sane Again," which I'd be happy to sell to all of you.
Is it made in China like the MAGA hats?
Yes, but I believe in free trade. Garry, so talk to us about solutions when it comes to Putin.
Yeah, but just, you know, you mentioned hats, and I just, during the primaries, actually just before Super Tuesday, I put on my social media just a little joke. I had Bernie Sanders wearing this tall hat that said, "Make America Greece again." Yeah.
That's Greece with a C.
Yeah, Greece. Yes, that's another MAGA, yes, but it's a socialist version. Yeah. And I couldn't expect, as it was a storm. It just, there was so many comments there, pro and cons, actually more, you know, were defending the idea of socialism, which I found a bit odd, because the people who never lived under socialism were teaching me what it was. Yeah. And it's by the way, the debate still goes on, but it's, as a response, I wrote a little piece, actually 133 words, on my Facebook page. And it's within the next few weeks, it went to more than 10 million views. So with tens of thousands likes and comments and retweets, just, you know, it's all over the place. Actually, and it was quite amazing, because I could feel like I hit a nerve. And just a few days ago, I just reminded people again, because now we're talking about Venezuela, and it's the same story. Oh, it was not a socialism. But what was a socialism? You know, it has been tried everywhere. And no matter what was the climate, religion, ethnicity, it ended up with the same problem. It didn't work. As Maggie Thatcher once wisely said, you know, the problem with socialism, one day it runs out of other people's money. And it's what worries me, and as Bret has explained it, is that if your politics works like pendulum, swinging from one side to another, if you push too hard to the right, then you can expect the pendulum to swing all the way to the left. And that's why the rise of the young star in Democratic Party, AOC, so from New York, and many others who follow her, it creates a real opportunity that Americans will be forced to choose between two extremes. And as I said already just a few minutes ago, that's a real danger. So, and an American political system, it doesn't seem to me just to have to build an immunity against these two viruses attacking simultaneously. And of course, Putin will be quite happy to expose both, as he did in the UK, on one side supporting Brexiteers, on the other side, I'm sure helping Jeremy Corbyn, an unreformed socialist and anti-Semite and terrorist sympathizer, to take over the Labour Party. So we have to, that's what the whole idea of Renew Democracy Initiative, RDI, is to help Americans to understand that, you know, there should be a proper solution. We cannot allow extremes to dominate American politics, and American history could offer us enough guidance how we could rebuild political system. Again, it's quite ironic that, you know, I was nominated the chairman of the board, and I'm the only non-American. which probably helps to bring people together from both sides, because nobody sees me as someone who is going to seize the opportunity and to just run for the Senate and use any of the political capital for my own advantage.
But solve Putin.
Oh, so Putin is, you can find a recipe from American history. Follow the money. It was good enough to remove a corrupt president from the office. And it would be good enough to destroy Putin's mafia state, because the way the Putin's regime works is it's not classical dictatorship of the 20th century. It's more like a mafia state with the boss, capo di tutti capi, and the groups, different groups surrounding him, and he works like a spine, balancing all the interests. In the mafia structure, loyalty is offered in exchange for protection. And as long as Putin can offer protection for different elite groups in Russia, both inside the country, but most important outside of the country, so he's invincible. So if they recognize that Putin is no longer capable of defending their financial interests, and the money that they took out of Russia, and we're talking about amount, some say, up to $2 trillion. $2 trillion. Wow. By the way, can you imagine what is, when you say billion, trillion, people just don't recognize the number. So that's why I try to work out a test. What is 1 billion? Quickly, what is 1 billion seconds? Nearly 32 years. 31.9 years. So the 1 trillion it's nearly 32,000 years. So just to understand the size of this money, this wealth. So if this money is no longer safe, if the free world shows political will to fight back, Putin is vulnerable. It will not take too long to send this message to Russian elite, to those who can typically solve the problems within mafia structure, when the boss no longer can offer protection for the loyalty.
And you were talking about the media, and in a way, it's such a despairing subject, because if from Gutenberg we get the Reformation and then the 100 years of war, actually the bloodiest war Europe had ever known up until the First and Second World Wars. What do we do about these new engines of social media, which are also vehicles of so much disinformation? Look at it from a media perspective. What are the sorts of things we ought to do?
I mean, the trouble with this issue is that everybody wants a kind of silver bullet solution. I was just at a meeting in Paris where there were lots of French politicians and others sitting around talking about this exact problem, and everybody's instinct is censor it. Don't let people say extreme things online. And lots of the politicians in the room were saying things like, people lie about me, it's terrible, they attack my children, they attack my mother, I just want to end this. And it's a sort of understandable instinct, particularly understandably French instinct. But ultimately, it's not going to work. I think it's really time that we start looking at social media. We always think of it, I think, because we're Americans and because these are American companies, as somehow, the untouchable products of our free market. Look, this is now our information system. This is how most people get the news now, is via social media. And certainly most people get most information via the internet. At some point, we need to talk about how to regulate it to make it work for us. And by that, I do not mean censoring it. Facebook has already employed, 10,000, 30,000 people to sit and read offensive posts and take them down, and this is absolutely useless and it doesn't work. We need to start looking, I think, at the structure of it. Do we want most of us to be communicating with one another on a system that works on an algorithm that maximizes the time we spend and emphasizes extremism? Is there a form of social media that can pull us together? Should some of these companies be broken up? Does Facebook simply have too much information about us? I know these are complicated systems and they're evolving all the time, but look, we managed to regulate capital markets. And financial markets are unbelievably big. They're international. Billions of dollars are at stake. Everybody's trying to cheat, and yet we can regulate it. So why can't we begin to think about regulating social media, and there's a precedent for this. And the precedent is at the time of the invention of radio. Radio, by the way, had a similarly kind of disorganizing effect on media and on politics. And the first two politicians who really understood radio and really made use of it were Hitler and Stalin. I mean, Hitler was a radio genius. And one of
well,
the
and FDR.
Sorry?
And
Well, I was going to say FDR was one of the solutions. Use radio to unite people, find a way of speaking, fireside chats, bring people together, instead of using radio to create extremism and anger.
Can I interject just very
and then I have another. And I think the other solution was the BBC. And the BBC was the idea of public broadcasting. You bring people together, you find some way of using this new medium to contact people. So so I'm not suggesting that we create, public broadcasting Facebook, but what is the modern equivalent? Isn't that the direction we should be thinking of? Should there be a public service algorithm? Should we have some say in how they work?
Let me throw something at you and just tell me how you'd react. Because if I had one silver bullet, I would require that everyone who's on Twitter or social media be a real person with their face on a picture and some way of locating them. Because nothing so civilizes speech as accountability for what you say.
And also, we give freedom of speech to real people. Yeah. We give freedom of speech to real people. We don't need to give freedom of speech to computer bots. Why do they get to say what there's no protection for that in our Constitution. But this is another piece of the story: transparency, anonymity. Why isn't political advertising transparent? Why don't you know when you're being targeted by a campaign? Why can't you open a Facebook page or actually any internet page and be able to find out where it's from and who created it? So if you're seeing a page that's, an anti-immigration activist and it's actually been created in St. Petersburg, why can't you figure that out? So, I'm just saying there are structural parts, both not just of Facebook, but of the internet that we should be talking about. If we didn't have a president who was distracting us with the wall and so on, I think this is what we would be focusing on. These are the kinds of issues. This is where we can say, all right, we're a democracy. This is our information system. How do we make it work for us?
It's so important what you're saying, because you now have. One of the reasons I'm opposed to burqas is that I think that to be a part of a democracy and to participate in the civic space, you not only have a right to look at what's happening, but you have an obligation of being seen.
I completely agree.
And right now, what we have is kind of one-way speech. Garry, you seem to want to jump in here.
Yes, it's just following what Anne said. I think we missed a moment where the internet concept that was originated as social network has turned into social media, which totally changes the relations. Social network is about connecting people. Social media is about affecting them by just using them as the targets for your advertising. So I think it's very important that we go back to the roots of internet, and that as Bret correctly said, requires transparency. So it will just implementing the measures that you mentioned could destroy the troll factory and the fake news industry that Putin built in Russia more than a decade ago.
Is there any historical precedent, Anne, for taking away a widely shared populist tool, power?
Taking it away. You cannot take it away. You just have to fight back.
I just want it to work differently. I don't want to destroy it.
No, I understand.
There are lots of precedents. We've had anti-monopoly laws in this country before, or competition laws in Europe.
But that's focusing on the few. I'm thinking about, because if you think about Gutenberg to this hour, it has been about the flow of power from the few to the many. And the irony, to Garry's point, is that the few have figured out how to manipulate the many.
Yeah, no, I'm in favor of that flow of power, and I'm not going to be nostalgic for, I don't want to think, I'm not trying to recreate some mythical media world, of the past. It's not going to come back in the way that it was, and so on. But there should be ways to fix it and make it better. There also should be ways of there should be new ways of finding and funding local news, for example. Somebody wrote in the Washington Post a couple of days ago a very good article about the new consortia and the new relationships that will be necessary to recreate, for example, local newspapers in Tennessee or Arizona that are being undercut by. That's another effect of the internet, is the undercutting of advertising and the business model for those papers, and we all know about that. But maybe they're going to be sponsored by local institutions like this one. Maybe they're going to be connected to universities. Maybe they'll be charities. Maybe the information gathering that they need, will be done in other ways. But thinking about how we remodel all these things, so that they work for us and they make sure that we still have. Another effect of losing local media is that people no longer recognize local politicians. And so they just vote according to party. I mean, if you don't really know who anybody is, if you don't know who's running for the mayor, or who's running for governor, then you vote, party ticket, and this also increases polarization.
I mean, one of the points here is, it is one of the reasons we call this the Renew Democracy Initiative, is that we probably have to think anew about rights and political customs that were established in a period that had no concept of the technologies that would be available. So, for example, this is a point I've heard Garry made before. We have a Second Amendment for a period where to load a musket took a minute or two, right, for a single shot. Now with a bump stock, a semi-automatic rifle can be turned into essentially an automatic rifle that can fire upwards of 90 to 115 bullets in a very short span of time, so you can have a massacre like of the sort that happened in Las Vegas. So very few people give themselves over to thinking again about how these institutions ought to work. Another one, and maybe you want to say something about this, John, is of course the gerrymander. Because part of the problem that we have with political polarization today is that the thing that any politician fears most isn't the guy on the other side or the woman on the other side, it's the primary.
Yeah, I first heard primary used as a verb, conjugate that. 8 years ago, I was talking to a member of the House who was on his way to a Senate seat, now in the Senate. And he called up one day about something, and I said at the end of the conversation, I said, does the caucus, this is probably 2010 or so fights over Obamacare, Boehner was looking like a crazy moderate to them, sort of tells you where we are. And I said, how crazy is the caucus? Or I'm sure I put it in a more dignified way. And he said, it's never been crazier. And I said, really? Why? He said, because nobody wants to be primaried. That there's no real general, there are about 40 seats, I think, is the common agreement, 40 seats that are genuinely in play. And one thing, Bret, if you'll just, total point of personal privilege, the only reason any of us have to remember poor little Elbridge Garry is because he created gerrymandering, and we all call it gerrymandering, but the only thing he's got going for him is that it was gerrymandering. So if we could possibly do that, I would appreciate it. I asked President Obama this, because he's doing the project on it. I said, could you at least call it gerrymandering? He said, that's not really a fight I'm going to take on. So I failed there, but we can start. The grassroots, let's stick together. Come on, Rancho Mirage will start the populist movement. There's some movement on this in a good way. I think there are 6 states, maybe, that, you all know this, that are looking at commissions doing it as opposed to legislatures. I think that's great, and I think that's actually a step, that's a genuine step in the right direction, because you would get legislators who feel accountable to both sides and not simply to the base of the party.
One thing that we should talk about before we leave the stage is civics education. Because I think one of the most depressing experiences that I have, particularly in my last life where I used to hire young people, was meeting these young students who come to the Wall Street Journal, and they had clearly high IQ individuals. And because they had convinced themselves that knowledge was not necessary in a world where information could be instantaneously accessed,
Right.
they knew next to nothing. So one of the things that we're doing at the Renewed Democracy Initiative, in March we're going to have a conference at the Johns Hopkins University, and what we're trying to do is teach civics, teach the foundational concepts of the free world. I don't just mean liberal democracy, but the free world writ large, to the students who are at Johns Hopkins or the other best universities in the country, so they kind of have an idea of why free speech is a good idea, why we have these amendments, why a free world defended and led by the United States is preferable to the alternative of a non-free world led by Maduro and Putin. So we have 3 minutes left. Just talk a little bit about civics education, what we ought to be doing, what the people in this room ought to be doing.
Go.
Just following to your brilliant lecture a couple of hours ago at the stage. So when you talked about a conflict,
Magnificent essays,
Yes,
brilliant
yes,
lectures.
yes.
We're as
No,
one.
You said that the truth is not necessarily in the middle. So both sides could be wrong, but it's not the middle road that helps you to find a way in the future.
Yeah.
I think it's very important that the history of the Cold War and the history of the United States will not be viewed with some sort of moral equivalence. Yes, the history of this country is full of sins and wrongdoings. It's a bumpy road, but it's still by far the best and the steadiest way of reducing conflicts and violence in the society. And I think young people of the 21st century, young voters and future voters, should understand that the values of the founding fathers that helped to build the greatest country on earth, so they are still valuable, and it's a still viable lesson. But we have to adjust them to the framework of the 21st century. So that was the whole idea of the book, and thanks for writing this in introduction, and hopefully we can convey the message to Americans of all stripes and ages.
Anne?
No, I agree. I agree that we need to think about civic education, but I think we should be clear that it's not just something that should go to students, and it also might have to take some new forms. It's not that we're not going to get everybody reading textbooks. Maybe there's an online way to do civics. Maybe there are ways of reaching people and targeting people using the tools that we now have in explanatory ways. I like the conversation about civics. As somebody who's written editorials for a long time, I've been hearing it for a long time, and it never seems to move fast enough. So what I'd really like to see is creative NGOs and other groups like ours and maybe others who can come up with ways of talking about the values of the Constitution and translating those values into language that young people and older people today can understand.
I have a proposal, which is that has anyone looked at the citizenship test recently? It's pretty good. It's a pretty good test.
Make everybody take it.
Yeah. You want your driver's license?
Starting with the Oval Office.
Yes, we start with the president, so that'll be. Seriously, it's 100. I think it's 100 questions.
Public test.
It's 100 questions. It's actually we had someone, our extended family, who took it recently, and if you want a driver's license, take the citizenship test, and why not?
If you want to buy a weapon.
If you want to buy a weapon, yeah.
I think it's a brilliant idea, and someone in this room ought to start a Center for the American Dream and put these thoughts in action. I just want to make one final point before we leave the stage, which is to Helene and Jamie and to the organizers. I mean, I'm sitting here, and here you have one of the finest historians of the Soviet Union on stage, Anne Applebaum. A consistently brilliant columnist at the Washington Post. She's always a must-read. She always goes deeper than anyone else. You have one of the finest historians of early America, of American history in general, not to mention an accomplished journalist in John Meacham, here on this stage. And, I think when the biographies of Garry Kasparov are written, they will note as a footnote that he happened to be a reasonably good chess player, but that he was a magnificent champion of human rights and the human spirit around the world and in the United States too. And to have all three of them on stage in front of you is a tribute to what Jamie and Helene have accomplished. So thank you very much.
That's sweet.